Hello and thanks for clicking on this video. Today we're going to look at creating a virtual machine or VM. To do this we need some software that's known as a hypervisor, and in this instance we'll be using Oracle's aptly named VirtualBox. So if you'd like to learn how to do this, stick around. Okay, so before we get started, let's quickly discuss what a VM actually is and why you might want to use one. Back in the day, when you bought a computer, it came with the operating system, whether that be Windows, Mac or Linux, and that was that. These days, although that process is still the same, you still buy a physical computer with a single operating system on it, you can then set up one or more virtual machines on that single computer. So you can think of a virtual machine as being a whole other computer within your main computer, and because that's a different computer entirely, it can be running a completely different operating system. So say for example you're running Windows like on this computer, you could choose to set up a Linux virtual machine, and then effectively you'd have a Linux computer you could use inside of your Windows computer. Now if you're new to this, I realise it can be a slightly difficult concept to wrap your head around, but don't worry because I'll explain how it works as we go along. So as to the question why you might want to do this, well, if we look on the screen here, I've put a few reasons as to why that might be. So the first one, as I've just hinted at already, is to try a different operating system. So as I said, if we're running Windows or say Mac, we might want to try Linux to see what we think of that. So we can set up a Linux virtual machine and then use it as though it was an actual physical real Linux computer. So that's one reason. If we look further down the list, next up it could be to run software that doesn't work on your current operating system. So a good example would be if you're running a Linux computer as your main computer, but you have a dying need to use Photoshop, which Adobe unfortunately doesn't make available for Linux at the current time, you could choose to set up a Windows virtual machine on your Linux computer, and then because you're effectively running Windows, you could within that Windows virtual machine run Photoshop. So that's an example of being able to run software that doesn't work on your main operating system, all through using a virtual machine. Next up, to better utilize the power of your PC. So these days, as we all know, computers are getting more and more powerful, so why not put that extra power to good use? Because a lot of the time we're barely using the performance that our computers are capable of. So an excellent way to make better use of that is to set up a virtual machine or more than one virtual machine on our main PC. So that's another great use for virtual machines. And then lastly, because we can. Virtualization is not a new concept by any stretch of the imagination, but as time has gone by, it's got easier and easier to set up and use, as I'll demonstrate and show to you through the course of this video. So with all that said, let's tick that and let's dig in. Right, so to get started we first need to get hold of the VirtualBox software. So let's open a web browser and we're going to search for VirtualBox. And here we go, the top entry, Oracle's VM VirtualBox. So if you click on that, we've got an enormous download button here that would be difficult to miss. So let's click on that to download the newest version. And within the download screen that it's now brought us to, if we look here, we've got the different with virtual machines, the machine that you're putting the hypervisor, the VirtualBox software onto, is known or referred to technically as the host. So the virtual machines are the operating systems within the host, but your main operating system, in this case Windows, that I'm running for the purpose of this video, is the host. So because I'm running Windows, I'm going to download the Windows host. You would obviously download the one to suit your operating system. So if you're running Mac or Linux, you've got download options there. So click the one that's relevant for you, as I've just done. That is now downloading here. Also with VirtualBox, although you could run it just on the one package, they provide a VirtualBox extension pack, which is definitely worth getting as well, because it adds additional functionality to your virtual machines. So out of the box, you'll notice things here like USB. If you were to just install the main VirtualBox package, it would only support the really old USB 1 standard. But if you install the extension pack, you've got both USB 2 and even USB 3. So to all intents and purposes, it will work almost like the physical computer that it's running on. Now, it won't run quite as well and as fast as your main machine, but as time goes by, this is getting better all the time, and the virtual machines are running faster and faster. And particularly if you install this extension pack, then that's going to help to do that. So let's click that to download the extension pack as well. And if we minimize the web browser out of the way and we come into our downloads in File Explorer, and there you go, they've downloaded. So you need to install them in order. So we're going to start with the main VirtualBox program itself. So if you double click on that, which will launch the installation wizard. So in a moment, here we go. So we're going to click next to proceed through the installer. We can leave the default settings as is and click next. These boxes are pre-checked, so it's going to create a start menu entry for us, a shortcut on the desktop, shortcut on the quick launch bar, and register the file associations. So if we double click any files related to VirtualBox later on, it will know what program they're associated with. So I'd suggest just leaving all those ticked and click next. And it's going to warn us now that while it installs, it can temporarily interfere with your network connection, because it obviously has to create virtual networking so that your virtual machines can also connect to the network and the internet as you set them up. So make sure you're not doing anything important on your computer that would require your network connection to be consistent just for the next minute or so while this installs. And so long as you're happy to do that, just click yes and then click install, and we have to say yes to allow it to continue. And here it goes, it's copying the files onto our computer and doing the install. And you're going to be prompted, there's boxes like this which it's basically wanting to install some extra device software, so allow that as well. And here it goes, it's popped a shortcut on the desktop already, and there we go, it's ready to start. So you can leave that checked to start the VirtualBox straight away, or you can uncheck it, which is what I'm going to do because I want to install the extension pack we downloaded first. So let's click finish, and then if we go to the VirtualBox extension pack and double click that, and here we go, so it's brought it up within the software and we've got the option to install. So you just need to agree to the license to use the extension pack. The main software itself is definitely open source. The extension pack, I'm not sure if they open sourced it more recently or if it's proprietary. I'm sure if you read the ins and outs of the license it would tell us. But I know initially it wasn't open source, but it doesn't make a difference in terms of us using it. It's still free, as in it doesn't cost us anything. So scroll down, and as long as you're happy with everything, click agree, and agree to that, say yes as well. And there you go, it's installed successfully the VirtualBox extension pack. So click OK. Right, now let's just close those down for a moment. Okay, so let's double click the VirtualBox desktop shortcut to get started, and this brings us to the VirtualBox Manager. And as you can see, it's quite a nice clean layout. If we look along the top, you've got these options, one to pin the tools here so it stays there. You've got the options, we're currently on the welcome screen, you can look at media, which is when we start attaching virtual CD, well it could be a physical CD even, if anybody uses those things anymore, but basically any media we attach to our virtual machines will show up in here. You've got options for your network adapters, so any virtual network adapters that we create will show up in here, and there's even cloud options now. So if we just go back to the welcome, we've got preferences, which this will show us all the ins and outs of the settings of our individual virtual machines, which I'll get more into this as we go through it in a moment. We've got the option to import and export appliances, as Oracle calls their pre-configured virtual machines. We've also got the option to set up a new machine, as we'll be doing in just a few seconds, and we've got the option to add an existing virtual machine. So this is nice. So if you've already created a virtual machine on one computer, you could then copy it over to another computer and add it to VirtualBox on a different machine and be running the same virtual machine on a completely different computer. So that's a really nice function to have as well. So let's get started and we'll go through setting up our first virtual machine. Right, so to do so we're going to click the new icon, and this is going to launch the VirtualBox Wizard, which will help us through setting up a virtual machine. So the first thing we want to do is give our new virtual machine a name. So what I tend to do is call it the name of the operating system that I'm going to install. So in this case I'm going to go with Ubuntu Mate. So give it any name that you like. The machine folder, VirtualBox will quite happily put it in your home directory. In VirtualBox VMs, this is the settings for the virtual machine as you set them up, so that's where they're going to be stored. I quite like to actually create my own folder and keep everything together in that folder so I know where it all is. So I'm going to open File Manager, move over to the left of the screen, and I'm going to go into Documents, and I'm going to make a new folder, and I'm just going to call it VirtualBox, and then I can close that, and I'm going to come to the drop down here, choose Other, and I'm going to locate that folder I've just set up, VirtualBox, and select that, and now it's going to put everything in my documents in my VirtualBox folder so I know where they are. As I say, that's personal preference, you don't have to do that, but I like to keep things neat and tidy and together. Right, so the type is the type of operating system. So because I typed Ubuntu Mate, the system is clever enough to detect that it's Linux. So if it got it wrong or you're choosing something else, you can select the type of operating system you're going to install from this drop down box, but I can leave it on Linux. And again, it's detected that I'm going to install Ubuntu. And it's guessed that I'm going to use 64-bit because most things these days are 64-bit. Again, if it had got it wrong or you're planning on installing something else different from what it says, you can just choose whatever it is on this drop down menu. So when you're happy with those options, click Next, and here we set the RAM, so the memory of the virtual machine. Now you want to be a bit careful with this. To run virtual machines, your computer really wants to have the more RAM the better. So if we just check, so if I do a check here, if I open File Explorer and right click on this PC and choose Properties, I can have a look in here, and this is my physical machine, the Windows computer, and you can see it's running an i7 processor, so there's plenty of power there. And it's got 16 gig of RAM, which again is plenty for a virtual machine or two. So check that on your machine and make sure how much physical memory you've got first, because you don't want to use up, I would never advise really using more than half of your physical machine memory on a virtual machine, because obviously whatever you assign to the virtual machine is going to be taken away from the physical machine. So you don't want to make it that the virtual machine is using too much memory and then your physical machine struggles to run because you've barely left it anything. So because I've got 16 gigabytes to play with, I can quite happily set it at 4096 meg, or 4 gigabytes in other words, for my virtual machine memory, and then click next. Now we're going to create a virtual hard disk. So in your real physical computer, it's going to have at least one hard disk, if not more. For the virtual machine, we're going to do the same thing. So you can actually have more than one virtual disk in a virtual machine. But for most people, a single virtual disk to run the operating system on and to use the machine will be sufficient. So we're going to create a virtual hard disk. If you'd already got a hard disk that you'd set up earlier, you can actually use an existing one here and choose it at this stage to basically bring in an existing virtual hard disk you've set up earlier. But because we're doing this from scratch, we're going to create a new virtual hard disk now. So make sure that option's selected and click create. Now we've got a choice of the type of virtual disk. So by default it's a VDI, which is the default format for virtual disk files or images for VirtualBox, but it will also work with VHD and VMDK virtual hard drives, which are from other platforms. So it's nice that it's cross-compatible with other systems, but because we're running VirtualBox and it's Oracle's, and we're basically just going to use that system, there's no real reason why you'd want to change this to something else, so I'd suggest just leaving it on VDI and clicking next. Okay, so on this next screen of the wizard, we're now looking at the storage on the physical hard disk. So basically we're setting up a virtual hard drive. Now we've got two options here, which is nice, because by default it will be dynamically allocated, or we can have fixed size. Now what that means is basically if you set it as fixed size, if say I was to set this virtual machine up with a hard drive that's 25 gigabytes in size, if I set it as fixed size, that's going to take those 25 gigabytes straight away from my physical hard disk of my computer and allocate them to the virtual machine. So in other words, 25 gigabytes of your free storage space on your computer will be used straight away and given to this virtual machine. Now that can be a good idea because it means that you'll never have a problem with running out of physical storage on your computer, because you'll have allocated it in advance all to the virtual machine. The alternative is to dynamically allocate the storage, and what this means is that the file, so if you think of this virtual hard disk as being a file on your physical computer, the file will start, it will only be as big as it needs to be to set up the virtual machine, and then as over time as you use the virtual machine, the size of that virtual disk, the file on your computer, will grow as you fill it with more things. So it will never grow above the size that you limit it to, but if you haven't got a lot of space on your computer and you've set it to dynamic, it could cause trouble further down the line because it will be bit by bit eating up some of that space. So it's up to you. It swings and roundabouts, because you can set dynamic, which is handy because it won't use as much space now and it can grow with time, or you can set fixed, which is the safer option, but it will take all of that space right now from your real computer, so it will be all allocated to this virtual machine. So choose whichever option you're happiest with and click next. I'm just going to leave it on dynamic and let that file grow, as you just saw. Right, so this is the location of where it's going to store our virtual hard disk. So again, in fact, because I set it earlier to that folder I created for VirtualBox, it's been smart enough to know that's where I want to put all my VirtualBox things, so it's already done it for me. If I wanted to change that or put it somewhere else, I can click the little folder icon and I have the facility here to put the folder the file wherever I want it. Now it's also created it with the name, so it's going to put it into an Ubuntu Mate, because if you remember I called the machine Ubuntu Mate after the operating system name. It's smart enough again to know that it puts the documents, the hard drive file, into that folder that it's created for me, so it's all there. I know it's in my documents, I know it's in VirtualBox, and in this case for this virtual machine I know it's in Ubuntu Mate, so it's done all that for me after the name of the machine and where I wanted to store it. So that's where you'd check that you've got it in the right place there. When you're happy with that, this is where we set the actual size of the virtual disk. Now this basically, you need to be careful here. So if we open File Explorer on the physical computer, and if we have a look in this PC, you can see on mine I've got a physical disk of 232 gigabytes. 209 gigabytes are free, so I've got plenty of space at the moment, so that's not an issue. But if you're running down on short on space, you need to make sure that you don't use it all and run into problems on this virtual machine, and you certainly can't use more than you've got spare, so it's got to be less than the size of your free space on your physical hard drive. So by default it's going to give it 10 gig, which is a bit mean really, so I'm going to up that to 25 gig. Now again, depending on the option you chose on the last screen, if I chose to make this a fixed size, when I click this create button, it's going to take 25 gigabytes of my hard drive space and use it all straight away to this VirtualBox, to this virtual machine. If on the other hand, as I did, you chose the option for dynamically allocated, although I've set it to use a maximum of 25 gig, it will only use as much as it needs as time goes by. So initially the file will be much smaller than that, but it can grow to 25 gig as time goes by, which, as I say, could potentially cause you problems later on if you forget about it and you start to run out of space. But just be aware of that and go with the options that suit you best. And then when you're happy with your size of your hard disk, click create, and there we go. It's effectively now set up, everything ready for us to install our new virtual machine. What I like to do is just check through some of the options before I actually set off on the installation, just to make sure that I'm not going to have any problems down the line. I like to get things ready ahead of time. So if I click the settings, this is going to allow us, this is that screen I showed you earlier under the preferences from the start screen of VirtualBox. It allows us now, because we've started to set up a virtual machine, it's more meaningful because there's settings in here that we can have a look if we're happy with them. So a lot of the defaults are going to be fine, but I'll just guide you quickly through what's what. So on the general tab on basic, very straightforward what we chose, the name we gave the virtual machine and the type of operating system it is and the version. On the advanced tab, basically you can a feature I've not discussed yet but is very useful for virtual machines is snapshots. We'll come to that later. This is where it's going to store them, so again it's smart enough to know I want them in that Documents VirtualBox folder I created earlier, and it's going to put them in my Ubuntu Mate folder that it's set up for this one machine, so that's nice and handy. You've got the option with the virtual machine to set up a shared clipboard and drag and drop. So although it is a separate machine, you can transfer things back and forth between your main host computer and the VM, or you can keep them completely isolated, which is the nice thing about virtual machines. It's up to you how much access or how little access they have between a virtual machine or multiple virtual machines and the physical machine. So I'll discuss that a little bit later once the machine's up and running, but you can set that ahead of time here as well. The description, nothing in there, that's okay. You can actually encrypt the disk if you wanted to, if it's going to be sensitive data that's on the virtual machine. I mean, if your physical machine's already running disk encryption, this isn't needed because everything's encrypted anyway. But if you're going to run something particularly sensitive in the virtual machine and your main machine is not encrypted, you could encrypt your virtual machine, which would just be as simple as ticking that, choosing an encryption cipher and then giving it a password to do the encryption, but we don't need to do that. On the System tab we've got the motherboard option, which shows us the RAM that we allocated earlier, the 4 gig. It also shows us the boot order, so just as on your real computer, you've got a boot option to start the machine. Here we can boot from floppy, from optical and from hard disk. Obviously floppy is extremely dated these days, so you're very unlikely to need the floppy option, so you can quite happily untick that. Optical and hard disk, you can leave those checked. The default chipset should be fine. If you have any problems running the virtual machine, you can choose a different chipset in here, but the default should be fine. You can leave those settings as they are. On the processor tab, I do like to change this one. By default it only allocates a single CPU core to the virtual machine, which if you can spare, again it depends on your physical machine, your actual computer, but if you've got a reasonable CPU in your computer with plenty of processing power and cores, it's a good idea to assign more than one to the virtual machine to help it run a bit faster. If we look, right click on the taskbar and choose Task Manager, and we have a look in the Performance tab, we can see here on my CPU I've got 4 physical cores on the CPU, so I could use all 4 of those cores if I wanted to on the VM, but it's probably not necessary to go that high. I generally just assign a couple of cores, so 2 cores to the virtual machine, which, as I say, helps it run that bit better than just having a single. So you can set that here. Acceleration, so VMs these days increasingly have, without getting too technical, they have more and more access to the physical hardware of your computer. In the old days they used to virtualize virtually everything, which obviously ran much slower. As time goes by, they're finding ways increasingly to utilize the physical hardware of your computer into the actual virtual machine to help it run better. And here, as you can see, it's got para-virtualization, which is a partial virtualization incorporating the physical hardware as well, so it helps speed it up. And here you've got hardware virtualization ticked here as well. So it's all to do, as it says, the acceleration tab. Happily leave it on the defaults, it helps speed the virtual machine up a little bit. If we click the display tab, here we can set the virtual graphics memory. So this is like your virtual graphics card. Now by default, again, it's a bit stingy, only gives you 16 megabytes, which isn't really a lot these days to do much with. So it's useful to grab hold of this slider, and I tend to normally, if I'm going to run a proper desktop operating system in the virtual machine, I bump that right up to the 128 meg. And you do also have the option here, I would tend to leave the graphics controller on the default, but you do have the option to speed it up even more by enabling 3D acceleration. Now it's always worth trying this, but if you do have any problems with your graphics, you may need to come back into these settings and untick this if you're having issues. Otherwise leave it ticked and it'll all help make the virtual machine run a bit faster. If we click the storage tab, this is basically where it's set up our virtual hard disk, and we do have the option here under the disk, the CD icon, to add in our ISO file, our virtual CD DVD that we're going to use to install the operating system in a moment. You can do that through here on this little drop down and choosing an virtual optical disk. I don't generally tend to do it here because there's an easier way when you start the machine, but you can select that here if you want to. The audio tab, again, generally that just tends to work. You get sound. I wouldn't worry too much about that. The network tab, this is a useful one. By default, when it enables your virtual network adapter, which is basically going to hook into your real network adapter on your computer to give you connectivity, it assigns it as a NAT device. So NAT or network address translation, what that does is it's like on your router where on the internet side you've got what's called a public IP address, and then on the home network side, the internal interface, you've got a local network address, and the translation, this network address translation, goes from one to the other. So it basically it's a mechanism for changing one range of addresses to another range of addresses, so it keeps them separate. In the case of your router, that gives you good protection from the internet. In the case of this virtual machine, if you leave it on NAT, that's going to help isolate it from the rest of your network. So it'll still get internet, but it just helps isolate it from, if you may not want it to talk to the other computers on your network, you might want to keep it completely separate. So if that's the case, then you can leave that on NAT. But if we click the drop down list there, we've got quite a few options in here. Now the one I tend to use most of the time is bridged adapter. What that does is it'll actually set it up so that it gets an IP address from your router. So that means that the virtual machine, to all intents and purposes, will be treated like a real computer on your network, and it'll be assigned an IP by your router, and then you'll be able to use it just like any other computer on your internal network. You'll even be able to access, if you've got a NAS box and shared files and things like that, you'll be able to access your home network if you select this bridge adapter option. You've got other options here that you can basically, if you really get into the ins and outs of virtualization, you can set up virtual networks and things, but it's beyond the scope of this video, so I won't worry too much. But your main two, as I say, if you really want to isolate, go with NAT, and then you'll still have internet, but it'll be more isolated from your network. Bridged adapter is the one I tend to use most of the time, because I generally want my virtual machines to be able to use my home network as well. So if that's the case for you, select bridge adapter. Now here under the name on the drop down option, it'll see what physical network adapters, what real network adapters you've got in your computer. So this computer here, I've got a LAN, an Ethernet adapter, and I've also got a Wi-Fi, a wireless chip, a wireless adapter. So depending on how the physical machine, how you're connecting that to your router and the internet, you need to make sure that you choose the option that your computer is using, so that the virtual machine will also use it to connect to the network and the internet. It had selected it there by default. It knows I've got a cable plugged in and I'm on the Ethernet, but make sure that you've got the right option selected, because this is where you might not get connectivity if it's trying to go through the wrong network adapter if you've got more than one in your computer. Serial ports, I wouldn't worry. You don't, unless you've got a specific use case, you're not going to use that. USB, so as I mentioned earlier, when you install the extension pack from Oracle with the VirtualBox, you now have the option to run newer standards of USB. So we can actually come in here and click the USB 3 option. So if we plug a USB stick into our computer, we can then assign that to the virtual machine, and to all intents and purposes use it exactly the same on the virtual machine as we would on our physical machine. And I'll show you how to do that once I've got the virtual machine up and running. Shared folders. What this allows us to do is to, if we wanted to, we could set up a shared folder between the host, our physical machine, and the virtual machine. So if you're going to use it long term, you might want to put documents into the folder that you're going to use between the main machine and the virtual machine. So if that's something that you wanted to do, I mainly use virtual machines for trying out Linux distros and testing purposes and things like that. But if you're going to use one long term, it might not be a bad idea to come in here, go to the folder path and other, and set up a folder and select it to share, so that anything you put in there you'll be able to see in the virtual machine and the physical machine. I'm not going to go into the ins and outs of setting that up here, because I'm aware that the video may be getting a little bit long and we've still got a bit to go. But that's where, if you wanted to set up a share, that's where you would do it in here. And then lastly, you've got the user interface, which generally I don't need to make any changes in here, so I won't worry about that. So when you're happy with all the settings in there, we're going to click OK, and that has now set up the basis for our virtual machine. So it's configured all of the virtual settings and everything ready to do the actual installation. So we've still got to install the operating system onto it, but we're now ready to go, which we'll do in just a moment. Okay, so let's get the operating system installed. So make sure that the virtual machine is selected and click Start, and it will open up a new window for us. Here we go. And this is what I mentioned earlier. You could have chosen in the settings where I showed you to choose the installation media that we're going to install the operating system off onto the virtual machine back in the settings. But if you don't, because it's a brand new installation, it's going to ask us, there's nothing there at the minute, so it's going to ask us where's the location of your installation media so I can install the operating system. So if you click the browse folder, it brings up the optical disk selector, and then all we need to do is click add, and now we're browsing our file system on our computer, and through the magic of video, and as they used to say on the children's TV program Blue Peter, here's one I made earlier. If we go into downloads, and I already downloaded my ISO file of the Linux distro I want to use, which in this case for the demonstration here is Ubuntu Mate. So obviously feel free to use whatever operating system you want, whether it's Windows or another Linux distro. Download it from the website of the operating system provider, and then from within your File Explorer, wherever you downloaded it to, select it here and choose Open. And that's now attached it to that virtual machine, so it's highlighted here. So if I click Choose and then I click, you can see here it's in the box, so I click Start, and I can close that little window there out of the way, and you can see that it's starting to launch the installation wizard for, in this case, the Ubuntu Mate operating system. So if we just wait till it gets to the beginning of the installer. So hopefully that was nice and quick for you, not so much for me, but the Ubuntu Mate operating system is now installed into our virtual machine. So here we are back at the VirtualBox Manager, and Ubuntu Mate is ready to go. So as I said earlier, to start a VM you need to select it, and then you can click the start button, or alternatively you can just double click on it, and that should launch the virtual machine. Here we go. So just close that out of the way, and here's our Ubuntu Mate operating system starting up. Okay, so here we are at the login screen, so I'll pop my password in and log on to the Linux desktop, and in a moment I'll discuss the shutdown procedures of how to close down a virtual machine. So from the desktop, when you're shutting the machine down, normally I'd recommend that you just do it as though it was a real computer, so the same as you would on your normal operating system. So this being the Ubuntu Mate desktop, I'd go to menu, the power option, and shut down, and that will obviously give it a nice clean shutdown and do the job properly. Now sometimes computers don't always behave how we want them to, and if that's the case and the virtual machine becomes unresponsive, then we have no alternative but to force it to close down. So if that's the case, if you come up to the top right cross of the window and click that, we have these options appear, and if you make sure that this one here, power off the machine, is selected, what that does is it's basically the same as yanking the plug out of the wall on a real computer, so it will kill the virtual machine regardless of what it's doing. So obviously don't do this all of the time, but if the machine gets itself into a mess and you can't do anything with it, this is an option to force it to turn off, and then obviously you'd click OK. Right, we don't actually want to do that now, so let's cancel out of that and have a look at what we've got with this virtual machine. The first thing you might notice is that the screen is quite small, so we can drag the VirtualBox window and make that bigger, but you'll see that the virtual machine is actually still running in the same small window. So let's just close this welcome screen out of the way. We could go into the operating system settings in the control center, into the display settings, and make the resolution higher so it enlarges the screen. That's one way of doing it, but I suggest a better and easier way is if we come up to the toolbar at the top and go to devices and insert guest edition CD image and click on that. What this does is it puts Oracle's VirtualBox tools into the virtual machine, so it allows us to install them, and as well as improve the display and the resolution, it will also install extra drivers and speed things up and just generally give us a better user experience. So it's well worth installing these extra tools. So if we click OK on the prompt and then choose run, and we got to type in our password again to run as administrator. And if you're doing this in a Windows virtual machine, it will look a little bit different. You'll have more of a wizard, but being Linux, it's quite terminal based, so it's running at the command line in the terminal. So doing the same job though, installing those extras. So as you can see now, it's saying press return to close this window. So if I do that, and we need to actually do a restart for those settings to take effect. So if I now click restart, and we'll just wait for the machine to go down, close any pop-up messages at the top. Okay, so we're back at the logon screen, but you can see at the moment it doesn't look any different than before. But the difference now, if we move this window up to the top left of our screen and now grab the resize handle, you can see that as I drag it across the screen, it is actually resizing the window for me. So without changing any resolution settings or anything, it's automatically filling the screen as big as I pull that window up. Which that's the difference, having put those tools in, it will now do that for us, which just makes life a little easier, and you can set it to any size you want. Alternatively, another nice option is we can actually go into full screen mode. So if we click this view drop down box at the top, we've got a full screen mode. So if we select that, and then it's telling us here how to get out of it, which there is keyboard shortcuts, but there's another way I'll show you in a moment as we do it. So if we click switch, okay, so at the logon screen in full screen, if I type in my password now, we can actually log into the virtual machine in full screen, and it effectively behaves as if we're in our computer. So it's as though I've got this different operating system installed on my computer because I'm full screen, and I'm using it as though it is my computer operating system rather than being an actual virtual machine. So as you can see, I can click on my start menu, I can go through the menus, I could load up a program and use the machine as if it was my actual computer, even though it is in actual fact running in a VM. So let's close the welcome screen. So we're here in full screen, and if once we've finished doing whatever we wanted to do, if you remember I said as well as the keyboard shortcut to exit full screen, there is an easier way. You can actually just bring your mouse pointer down here to the center of the screen until this little menu bar pops up, and over at the right hand side we've got these options for minimize, maximize and close the window as you would with any windowed screen. So if we literally go down to the windowed mode option, it brings us back into a nice window on our desktop where we were before, and then we can just use it as we would any other program in a window within our operating system. Right, we're getting there now, and thanks for sticking with me for this long. I realise the video is getting a little bit longer than usual. There's just a couple of little things I'd like to show you before we go, just to try and make the experience of using VirtualBox a little bit better. Just before we do that, you can see that the tools installer that we put in to improve the experience is still mounted in the operating system. If you come up to devices and optical drives, you can actually remove the disk from the virtual drive. Now if you shut down the machine first, it'll just remove it, but you can do a force unmount which will just remove it because we're not using it anymore, just to take that off. So that's no longer connected to the virtual machine. Now one of the most useful things might be to move files and folders between the two operating systems. So obviously I might want to move things from my Windows computer into this Linux operating system that I've set up. Now the easiest way probably to do that is if we come to the devices drop down menu and to drag and drop. By default this functionality is disabled, which if you were running say an older Windows 7 or XP operating system as a virtual machine, you might want to leave this disabled for security. But if you're not too bothered about that, or you're running a Linux operating system or something that is, you know, an up-to-date operating system, you probably are going to want to share your files. Now you've got the nice functionality choices here of you can either do it one way, so you can go host to guest. Now as we said earlier, your main computer is referred to in these circles as a host. Now virtual machines are quite often called guests, so effectively what that's saying is we could drag and drop files from the host, in this case Windows 10, to the guest, the Linux virtual machine, or we could have them going the other way, so we have the functionality of being able to move files and folders from the guest to the host, or even better, we can do a bi-directional and go both ways. So if we select that, now that's turned on the functionality of moving files and folders between the two operating systems. So to demonstrate, if I open a File Explorer window, and I'm just going to grab for a demonstration a picture, and let's just grab VirtualBox. So let's start to drag that by holding down the left click on our mouse, and if we pull it across here, you can see as we come into the window of the virtual machine, it's now got a copy appeared. So if we let it go, that's now copied across from the host machine to the guest. So it's there now. If I was to double click that picture, it's literally coming up with this picture that I created earlier for the backdrop of the desktop. So that's now in the virtual machine, and likewise we could pull it and pull it back to the host operating system as well. So that's a nice easy way to transfer your files and folders back and forth. Likewise, again under devices, you've got the option of having a shared clipboard. So your clipboard, when you copy and paste, again it's disabled for security, but if you're quite happy to copy and paste between the two operating systems, again you could turn on bi-directional and copy something from your main computer onto your virtual machine. So that's built in there as well. Again, we've got the shared folders that I mentioned briefly earlier, so you could, if you're going to do this a lot, you could set up a folder on your host machine that's accessible from the guest. So that's another option as well. So the choices are there. If you remember, I also mentioned earlier in the video that it's possible to connect a USB stick or external hard drive to your computer and access it within the virtual machine as if you'd plugged it straight into that. Now, how you do that, and I'll just demonstrate now, is if I connect a USB stick to my computer, so I'll plug that in now to the USB port. There we go. So if I open up File Explorer, so this is within the host Windows computer. You can see I've got the USB E drive, and I've already put a folder in there, My Files, with a top secret text file saying keep out. And so that's accessing it within Windows, obviously having just plugged it into my Windows PC. But I want to access that same USB stick in my Linux virtual machine. So to do that, I need to click on the Devices drop down menu at the top of the window, come down to USB, and you'll see that there's a list of all the USB devices plugged into the computer, and I know that mine's a SanDisk Ultra USB stick, so if I click that, and you'll hear it make the connection noise, and now you can see it's popped up on the desktop, or in fact it's opened it for me. So there you go. Again, we've got our My Files folder, which I can double click on, and it's got my top secret file, and if I click on that, there you go, it's opened in a Linux text editor. So it was Notepad, I think it opened in Windows, and we've got Pluma here in Ubuntu Mate as the default text editor, again telling us to keep out. So there you go, and when you've finished with that USB memory stick, you can click Devices again, USB, and if you click on it again, as you can see, it's just disappeared and it's no longer available in the guest Linux virtual machine. So that's how to deal with USB, connecting USB sticks and hard drives to your virtual machine. Right, so let's just have a quick look at what's happened to that folder we created to store all our virtual machine content in. So if I open up File Explorer on the Windows computer, and I go to my documents where I did it, and into VirtualBox, and there you go, within VirtualBox we've got our Ubuntu Mate folder that VirtualBox created for us, and you can see it's building up all the files associated with the virtual machine. So make sure that you don't delete or remove any of this if you're wanting to keep and use the virtual machine. And if you wanted to back up the virtual machine, this folder here is what you would need to back up. And obviously if you create more virtual machines, you'll have more folders that potentially need backing up. And what you've actually got in here is you've got a virtual hard disk, which, as you can see, it's now nearly 7 gigabytes in size, but that can grow because it's dynamic, not static. It can grow up to a potential of, I think we set it to 25 gig. You've got the Ubuntu Mate virtual machine settings file, so that's got all our configuration in that we set up earlier. So that's where that's stored. You've got a logs folder, so if you're having any issues, that's where you find the logs for your virtual machine. So basically just keep this folder safe. When you're running a virtual machine, the VirtualBox Manager will still be open in the background unless you closed it. Now there's no reason really to close this down, as it can be quite handy to keep it open to delve into if you need to. But if you do close it, you'll notice that the virtual machine will carry on and run regardless. It doesn't need to be open for this to run. But as I said, it can be quite handy to just leave it open in the background. So let's just shut this virtual machine down. The last thing that I need to mention that I brought up earlier was snapshots. So this is a brilliant system that you can use with virtual machines that allows you, once you've got the machine set up how you want it, you can take a snapshot of that machine, and then if anything goes wrong at a later date, you can just roll it back to that earlier time. Be aware, if you do go back to a previous snapshot, any files and folders and changes and things that you've made since the last snapshot you took, you will lose them. So obviously that's the reason you would take a backup independently and separate of your snapshots. But this is a great way to keep your operating system, your virtual machine itself, up and running. So to do that, we click this little menu here and we've got the snapshots option, and within here we can click the take button and then you can call it whatever you want. So what I tend to do is when I've very first set up a virtual machine and I've got it all how I want it, before I start experimenting and trying things out in there, I'll do a snapshot, and quite often I'll just call it backup, and then if I OK that, and that's it, as fast as that. It's created a backup snapshot there. So obviously this is the current state, which, because it's turned off, we haven't made any changes since then anyway. But if things did go wrong and at some point, for whatever reason, I wanted to come back to this point in time, I can come into these snapshots, select the backup, and it's as easy as clicking on restore, and it'll take us back from wherever we are in a mess back to the backup. And you can take these snapshots as often as you want, so you can just come in and click that and keep taking snapshots, and then roll back to them if you need to or have any problems. I just realised there is one more important point to cover, so this is the last thing we're going to talk about very quickly. When you've finished with your virtual machine, if you don't want to keep it anymore, obviously you may wish to delete it to free up space on your computer hard drive. So to do that, from within the Oracle VirtualBox Manager, all you need to do is hover over the virtual machine you created with your mouse pointer, right click on it, come down to remove, and you have the option to remove the machine only from the virtual manager, but that will leave all of the files in place on your hard drive, so it won't free up space. So what you might want to do instead is this option here, to delete all files, and if we click that, there we go, that should have gone. So if we just check, there we go. So now within Virtual Manager, our virtual machine has been removed. And if we just have a quick look in the Documents and VirtualBox folder, as you can see, Ubuntu Mate has been deleted from our hard drive. Right, we've finally made it to the end. Again, thanks for sticking with me if you made it this far. It did turn out to be quite the marathon, but I hope that you now feel more confident finding your way around VirtualBox and able to easily set up a virtual machine so that you can play around with all the technology it has to offer. If you found the video helpful, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you'd like to be kept aware of when I post the next video, click the bell icon. Until next time, take care.